Well, today we're going to take a look at the West, Europe and the West after World War II. So this would be the period from 1945, 1946 on up to about 1989, but we're going to look at the early part of that right now, and what's called the Cold War. It's called the Cold War because it never heated up into a actual armed conflict between the main combatants. So the Cold War is the United States and the USSR who begin to sort of divide up the world with their influence. They are the two superpowers that emerge after World War II. So, some people debate the exact length of the Cold War, but 45, 46 to about 1989, 1990. The Cold War begins in Europe, and then it will spread across the world. The Soviets, remember now the Soviets at the last time we talked, the Soviets had marched from the Soviet Union into Europe and into Germany and actually marched into Berlin. And in fact, the Allied forces of the British and the U.S. forces slowed down so that the Russian forces, the Soviet forces, would meet them in Berlin. This was a strategic move and a controversial one. So basically it left Germany divided or at least occupied in the east by the Soviets, in the west by a combination of the U.S., Britain, and France. Okay, so this sets the stage. The Soviets therefore have marched through Eastern Europe. They've occupied the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the eastern part of Germany. The U.S. and its allies of France and Britain have marched through France and into the western part of Germany. Now, the idea here was to have free elections after the war. In other words, what to do with all this land. The Germans had occupied a lot of land and had even taken control of land. And there was a lot of land that they had taken over at the beginning of the war. What was to happen with all this land? The idea here is that all of these people should have a free election and should decide their own destiny, so to speak, and decide their own government and what they would be. Of course, the definition of free elections was different for the Soviets than for the United States and the western part of the Allies. Free elections there were seen to be more a democratic approach, whereas in the East, the Soviets had kind of a different idea of what a free election was. At any rate, we should talk about what sets up the Cold War and what sets up what happens right after World War I. These are three conferences that actually take place during World War II that set the stage for what's going to happen after World War II. So let's take a look at those three conferences. Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. So we're going to look at those three in order. Here we see the first one at Tehran, and this is in what today would be Iran. They're meeting in Iran, in Tehran, in 1943. Here are the three big leaders of the Allies. On the left, of course, Stalin from the Soviet Union. In the center, Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the United States. And on the right, Winston Churchill from England. They're meeting in November of 1943. Now, it's here that they devised the plan that the American and British forces would invade France and push into Germany, this D-Day that we talked about last time under Eisenhower. And, of course, that the Soviets would push from the other way, from the west, and push towards Germany, that Germany would be then confronted with strong forces pushing towards them both east and west. Then, of course, these forces would meet in Germany. Now, following the war, Germany would be partitioned Kind of like you'd have a room, put a partition down the middle of it, you divide it, one room into two. So that's what's going to happen to Germany. It's going to be partitioned into a Soviet section, a United States section, a Great Britain section, and a French section. Okay, zones they'll be called. And then, of course, after we have the denazification of Germany, that is, we remove the Nazi party, the Nazi influence, so that we can have a true, free election, free of Nazis, then the idea was Germany would be reunited under a new government. Of course, that was not to happen for quite a while. But that was the plan. Now, I want you to take a look at these pictures. Take a look here at Roosevelt in the center. This is in November of 1943. Take a look at Roosevelt here in February of 1945. A tremendous difference in his appearance and in his health. And this was roughly a little over a year, about 15, 16 months. His health had greatly declined, and we know he was going to make it until April. So he's got about 2 months to live, roughly. So here you see Churchill on the left, Roosevelt in the center, Stalin on the right. Now, by the time the Yalta Conference takes place, and Yalta is the peninsula, it's on the peninsula south of the Soviet Union in the Black Sea, what today at one time was, had been taken over by the Germans, but the Soviets had gained control again. They're meeting there. You can see it is cold. It is February. Now, it's sure at this point that Germany will be defeated. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They are on the ropes, so to speak, in Europe, in North Africa, and so forth. And so the Churchill and FDR always were more allies with each other than they were with Stalin. They didn't really trust Stalin. I don't think Stalin trusted them. But the assumption was that the Soviets were weak, that the Soviets, couldn't push that far into Germany, and if they did, they couldn't maintain it. They underestimated the power of the Soviets. That is Churchill and Roosevelt. It was going to take 11 million Soviets to occupy Eastern Europe, and they felt, the Soviets didn't really have that kind of manpower to be able to sustain that. Stalin was suspicious of the Western leaders, Churchill and FDR, and likewise they were suspicious of him. But what Stalin wanted was a buffer. He wanted Eastern Europe to be a buffer between him and, say, Germany and France and any of the Western powers, so that if they did decide to invade him or fight him, which, I think he anticipated there might eventually be a war, that he would have this buffer of Eastern Europe for him to prepare for any fighting that might take place. Of course, the Western allies were not for this buffer. And we see then that Stalin then wanted to maintain what are called spheres of influence, a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. Now, Roosevelt at Yalta definitely wanted self-determination for Europe. This was his key thing. In other words, that these territories would control their own destiny in the future. That is, they would not be dominated by the Soviet Union or Great Britain or the United States. Now, they were worried about the Soviet Union. So we see the other thing that he wanted, though, is that he knew he was going to have to face the Japanese. And he was pretty much facing the Japanese in the Pacific alone. There would be almost no help there. But he wanted the Soviets to help him. Because what he was anticipating is he was going to have to do an amphibious assault on Japan, much as they were going to have to do an amphibious assault on France to knock out Germany. And it was assumed that at least 1 million American soldiers would die in an amphibious assault on Japan. And so Roosevelt wanted the Soviet help to try to alleviate some of that because it was everybody felt and knew, I think we're pretty sure, that the Japanese were not going to surrender. They would fight to the last man. The atomic bomb was not yet finished, and we talked about that last time. And so this is going to have to be in a conventional way with an amphibious assault. You have to line up a lot of troops in, say, the Soviet Union and China and anywhere they could, and then launch across to the island of Japan. And so he wanted the Soviets' help. So what that means then is that it's put Roosevelt at a weaker position, that he's willing to agree to some of the Soviet demands in order to get them to agree that they would help us fight the Japanese once the war with Germany was over. So Yalta continued. There are two ports, one in Manchuria and the Kuril Islands. The two ports of Manchuria and the Kuril Islands. This is what the Soviets wanted in return. This is territory they wanted from Japan. Now, part of that, Kuril Islands, had been their territory before, and these harbors in Manchuria were important because they were warm water ports. And so that was agreed to by Roosevelt. And also, the Soviets were to agree to the concept of the United Nations, which Roosevelt had, so pretty much imitating in some measures what Wilson had with the League of Nations. And they would create a Security Council which would have the main players in the world after World War II would kind of control the United Nations. Soviet Union, United States, Great Britain, France, so forth. The UN actually will begin after World War II, after the Germans surrender. It'll be established in April of 1945. It'll be, as you know, I assume you know, housed in New York City, as the United States provided the land and the funding to build the building and so forth. And it starts convening right after the German surrender in April of 1945, and of course it's been going ever since. Now, the other thing they reaffirmed was the unconditional surrender of the enemies, which they had agreed to earlier. Both the Japanese and the Germans would surrender with no conditions. It would be a total loss for them, a total surrender. Now, there was some argument over Poland. What would happen to Poland? Poland was, of course, within the sphere that the Soviets wanted under their sphere. The United States wanted there to be free elections in Poland. The Soviets said it must be in its sphere. So, obviously, Poland does eventually become in their sphere. There are so-called free elections, although the United States and the West never really accepted that those were really free elections, the way the Soviets would run those elections. And then here's the third conference. Notice now Roosevelt is gone. Roosevelt has died. The Potsdam Conference takes place after the war is over in Europe, before the war is over in the Pacific. And we see here now some new players. Churchill has been replaced. Sort of the bulldog of England who brought him through the war, many people felt was too conservative to lead in non-wartime. And so we have Attlee, who is a more liberal leader. We have Truman, who has been thrust to the forefront by the death of Roosevelt. And, of course, we still have Stalin. But the mistrust is there. Truman and Stalin and Attlee, these are all new players, except for Stalin, and, so they didn't trust Stalin. And Truman proves to be less flexible, with these agreements that Roosevelt had made, because I think he knew about the atomic bomb, and I think he knew, and there's even some evidence that he received word while at this conference that the atomic bomb was ready. And so then that made the cooperation of the Soviet Union to take out Japan less needed. In fact, it wasn't needed at all, because we felt if we dropped an atomic bomb, the Japanese would surrender and we wouldn't have to make an amphibious assault. So this probably explains why Truman was less flexible than Roosevelt. So he learns about the A-bomb, that it's ready while he's at Potsdam, and certainly this probably changed his view. Truman then begins to really demand free elections, and he doesn't want to make concessions to the Soviets. So everything kind of changes between these two meetings. From February to July, a lot has changed with the leadership of the main players of the Allies. So at Potsdam, of course, there's growing tension. Why? Because Stalin refuses. He refuses these ideas. He already had an agreement, he felt like, and they should be honored. He wasn't going to go along with it. And that is when really the debate began. As the United States forces were still, the Allied forces were still in Germany, still in Europe. Some people were pushing that we would go ahead and just keep our forces and move through Eastern Europe and push the Soviets back into Russian territory, Soviet territory, and liberate Eastern Europe. Generals like Patton and others pushed for that. But eventually, I think others did not have the will to keep fighting in Europe, especially when they had to face Japan. And so that's what set the stage for a divided East-West Europe and a divided Germany. The view of the Soviets is that the West were imperialists. They just wanted to take over everything, control everything. And of course, the West viewed the Soviet Union and communism as a kind of conspiracy to dominate the world, certainly dominate Europe and so forth. So there was no trust there between them. This is also what leads to the Cold War. Now here is a map of Europe after World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War. You can see now this red line. See it going? This red line that divides. Here's Yugoslavia. But basically, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. And it's divided. Eventually, this line here, you can see it starting up in Germany, going down past Czechoslovakia and Austria, coming down really this way, down to the Adriatic. This will come to be known as the Iron Curtain, the Iron Curtain. And so you have some different routes of it here, but most people would put the Yugoslavia behind the Iron Curtain. This one shows Yugoslavia outside the Iron Curtain because Yugoslavia was a little more independent of the Soviet Union, although they were a communist nation. So, at any rate, this half, this east half, including Yugoslavia, was communist, and this half over here were free democratic nations. Now, not only was Germany divided, east and west, but Berlin is divided, the capital city, east and west. So you have the Soviet section in the east sector, the French, the British, and the U.S. sector here. We're going to talk more about that. So notice here's the territory lost by Germany. Here's territory gained by the Soviet Union, is this green color. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and so forth. This is all gained by the Soviet Union. And then here are territories where you have fledgling nations that are satellite. So, this stuff was added. Estonia, all this stuff was added to the Soviet Union. This became satellite nations of the Soviet Union. Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, so forth. And then East, what would have been East Prussia and all that kind of stuff as well. So the Iron Curtain. Now, the Iron Curtain is not a physical curtain or wall. It is there were borders there, and they were highly guarded. But it was basically marked the difference between the Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Churchill gave a famous speech in 1946. This is after he was no longer prime minister, but he was in the United States on a lecture tour giving a speech, and he said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." That name stuck, and people began to call it an Iron Curtain. It divided not only Europe east and west, but it divided Germany east and west. Now, in the eastern part of Germany was the capital city of Berlin. The capital city of Berlin was surrounded by eastern Germany, but there was a section of Berlin that was West Germany. It was actually controlled by the British, the French, and the the United States. And this was a free part, a free city, a free half of the city, but in the midst of a Soviet-controlled territory. So this is going to set things up, and eventually a wall, a physical wall, concrete wall, will be built there, and this is known as the Berlin Wall. So basically what's set up now is we have two hostile camps in Europe, and eventually this will kind of divide the whole world between East and West, Soviet Union, United States. And of course, for the Soviets, they say, yes, we're all for free elections, but they interpreted what a free election was, and actually by Western standards, it was not a free election. So the Soviets sent troops in, and they occupied Eastern Europe, and they occupied East Germany, and they occupied East Berlin. And they set up puppet governments there. That while this wasn't technically Soviet territory, it was Soviet-controlled territory. In places like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so forth, the leadership there had to answer to the Soviets to stay in power. And the Soviets would send their troops in for, troop maneuvers with tanks and all kinds of things like that to put the pressure on. All of Eastern Europe, except for Yugoslavia and Albania, were basically under the domination of the Soviet Union, but Yugoslavia and Albania were also communist countries. Communist parties here took over themselves without Soviet help. So they had a little more independence of the Soviets, but still very much communist. Albania was a very closed country for a long time. And Tito ruled Yugoslavia with an iron fist. So here is the map. Here's a map of the Iron Curtain. Notice this places it, Hungary and Yugoslavia, behind the Iron Curtain. So here, this is the Italian border. So along the Italian border, along the Austrian border, and the border of Czechoslovakia with Austria, and then into Germany. It divides Germany all the way up here to the Baltic Sea. So it's about 1,600 miles long, and this is what's called the Iron Curtain. Now, it's not a curtain made out of iron, as I've had some people write on tests and things, or on their terms. It is a boundary between East and West. And much of the boundary then becomes the boundary between countries. And it actually, two separate countries will form out of Germany, East and West Germany. Now, the other thing to remember is that the United States had a policy to try to contain communism. They called it the containment policy. It was set forth by George Kennan, that basically the communists would expand and just keep expanding, and that expansion should be contained in order to preserve freedom in the West and democracy. So this policy of containment, which really came to the forefront of our foreign policy in July of 1947 under Secretary of State Dean Acheson, set up a great amount of giving of money, foreign aid, to countries that were seen to be in threat or having a threat of them becoming a communist nation. So the United States was going to send military and economic aid to countries that faced a communistic threat. Why? They wanted to contain communism, and they felt the best way to do that was to bolster these countries. Some liken the spread of communism to the spread of rotten apples in a barrel. You've probably never seen apples in a barrel, but basically if you have an apple that's touching other apples and that apple is rotten, the spread of rottenness of the apple will spread to the apples surrounding it and then soon to the entire barrel or container of apples. And so that's the way communism was seen. If communism was near another country, it's going to influence the other country more than if it's further away. So we need to insulate those apples or those countries that are near the rotten apple of communism. And we see this ultimately as foreign policy because communism was a threat, or was seen as a threat, to the West and to the United States. So this is a matter of foreign policy. So this is what ushers in then a massive amount of aid. U.S. aid to Europe, where aid is given, first of all, to Greece and Turkey in March of 1947. This is technically known as the European Recovery, Economic Recovery Plan, but it's more commonly known as the Marshall Plan of June of 1947. $13 billion, and of course those are 1947, 48 dollars, not today. That's a huge amount of money. Goes to rebuild Europe, rebuild Germany, rebuild France, and so forth. So much of the economic recovery of Western Europe is because the United States invested billions and billions of dollars into these countries. Communist expansion would lead to economic turmoil. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union did not put any money into Eastern Europe, really almost nothing, and Eastern Germany. In fact, they tore down, they dismantled factories in East Europe and moved them, Eastern Europe, especially eastern part of Germany, and moved them to the Soviet Union. So they were dismantling things instead of building it. So the guy who ran all this was the World War II General George C. Marshall, now, of course, a civilian, and it's then named after him by most people, called the Marshall Plan, to oversee the recovery of Europe. Now, the Soviets saw this as just the United States buying their way in and gaining influence over Europe, and they saw it as Western imperialism. They didn't see it as something nice the U.S. was doing to help these countries, but simply as a way for us to take over. So that was their interpretation of this. Now, all of this is going to lead to a crisis in Berlin. Remember that Germany is divided east and west, but in the territory of Eastern Germany now, or the eastern part of Germany, which is controlled by the Soviet Union, is the capital city of Berlin. Berlin, since it was a special city in the capital, was also partitioned into four parts. The West, the French, the British, and the U.S. sectors, and in the East, the Soviet sector. This is what's going to set the stage for the Berlin crisis. Germany divided into four zones, Berlin divided into four sectors. The British, the Soviet, the U.S., and the French zones and sectors. Well, the British, the French, and the U.S. pretty much saw in agreement what should happen, but of course not the Soviets. So the way that West Berlin was being set up was as a free city, but a free city in East Germany controlled by the Soviets. The Soviets didn't like that, and they wanted to try to take control of all of Berlin, but they didn't want to do it with military forces and invasion. They decided to do it in another way, by an embargo, basically. So when the West began its plans, they unified their sectors and zones, their zones of western part of Germany, and their sectors of the western part of Berlin. But the Soviets would not join into that because they didn't see that as an option for them. So this meant that we have East-West Germany, we have an East-West Berlin. So what happens now, if you can see here, the sectors of Berlin in the lower right, and the Soviet side here, and then you can see it in a more conventional map in the upper left-hand corner. And you can see that West Berlin had 185 square miles, East Berlin 156 square miles. So they're about the same size, a little bit different, a little bit smaller for the Soviet side. So what happens then in 1948 is that the Soviets were not going to allow Western goods and Western things to flow in. Basically, they were coming in by road and by train from western part of Germany into the western part of Berlin. So what the Soviets did, instead of attacking and trying to take over West Berlin, is they just said no trains and no trucks or anything can move through Eastern Germany to get to West Berlin. The idea was to put a blockade on West Berlin and basically force the hand so that West Berlin would have to surrender to the Soviets and that Berlin would be unified. Of course, the Allies in the West didn't like that idea, and they began an airlift. You can see from 1948 to 1949. You can see the large cargo planes up here in the upper left and the lower left. These planes then would airlift supplies to West Germany, or West Berlin from West Germany, from February 1948 to May of 1949, so over a year. And they're going to have to carry in fuel, diesel fuel, food, medical supplies, everything that was needed. 13,000 tons of goods were delivered every day by air. And it became clear that East and West were not going to be unified. West Germany was formed in September of 1949. Its official name, the Federal Republic of Germany. And East Germany forms, too, about this same time, as the German Democratic Republic. So FDR, the FRD, and the GDD, the DDR, the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, and the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRD or DRF. So we see that there's East and West now. As of the fall of 1949, those two countries will not reunite for about 40 years. They'll be divided. Now, what happens is that the Soviets actually build a wall down through Germany, or down through Berlin, to divide it. This is known as the Berlin Wall. At first, it's just a militarized line, and then they actually build a concrete wall, a fortified wall that divides the city. Because they didn't want people from East Berlin escaping to West Berlin, and of course, people from East Germany could make their way to East Berlin and then go into West Berlin, and then from West Berlin get to West Germany. They wanted to cut that off. And so they did, with a physical wall. So we see then another thing that happens at the end of World War II is we have two Germanys. There's one thing they could kind of agree on. They wanted to go after German war criminals, Nazi war criminals. So the U.S., Britain, Soviet, and French all want to go after that. So there are the Nuremberg trials of 1945. 2 million trials between sort of mid-1945 to 1948. But remember, there's never a treaty to end the war with Germany because Germany's not unified. So it's a very unusual situation. Germany lost the war, then it was divided, and so there couldn't really be an official peace treaty of Germany because now it's East and West Germany. So a peace agreement was made with West Germany. The Germans' factories, on the other hand, the Soviets were hauling German factories out of East Germany and hauling to the Soviet Union. So while the United States is actually building up West Germany and its economy, the Soviets are literally tearing it down. So this creates a great economic difference between East and West parts of Germany. And we have two superpowers now, the United States and the Soviet Union. So this sets the stage then for the Cold War. And it begins here in Europe. It begins in Eastern Europe, and especially we can see it in East and West Germany, and we really can focus in on it between East and West Berlin. So this then is the beginning of the Cold War.